Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch in History, or of History. Um, Today's episode is America's Holy War. In the prior episode, we discussed the motivations and preparations taken by the leadership of the United States government to enter the war, and today we're going to talk about the motivations and preparations of the American people at large. The reason I chose this particular title is because even though there was vocal opposition to the war, this was very much the minority. The majority of Americans were quite in favor of the war in a way that I think would be hard for us to understand today. Unless you lived through the Second World War, you get a sense of just the level of impact that the war had on people's day-to-day lives. In the later 20th century and in the 21st century in the United States, we have been involved in many conflicts, but if you don't have a direct personal connection to the war, or you don't watch the news, it doesn't really impact you. But World War I wasn't that way. It was something that affected everyone in very personal or very direct ways. And the motivation of the American people was very intense. So hence the title, that this was almost seen as an issue of fate or destiny for the country. So with that, let's get talking about motive. So the motive of the American people to support the war. Now this is a very complicated topic, but for simplicity's sake, you can break down your average American's motive into two categories. You had, which can be summed up in two commonly used phrases at the time. One we discussed a little bit before, war to end war. So a war to end war, and the others was my country, right or wrong. So let's talk a little bit about what these motives were and what kinds of people found themselves, or what kind of beliefs gravitated people to one or the other. There were two major groups that made up the war to end war group. There was the first group, and in many ways maybe the most vocal group, or at least vocal in their writings, in papers and things, maybe not vocal in day-to-day life, but this is the record that we have. And that came from so I can fit it, idealism. And that's very much the narrative that was pushed by Woodrow Wilson, this idea that this war was going to usher in a new era in history. The American people hadn't been living under a rock since 1914. They were very familiar with the war. Popular magazines and newspapers would print maps of the war zones and encourage their readers to cut them out, mount them on the wall, follow the different armies and battles with pins and markings. So for the entry of the war, this concept of this endless, dragging, horrid war was now going to be brought to a dramatic end by America. That it was America's destiny to end this monstrosity. There was a philosophy or a point of view at that time that America had broken with Europe, had formed independently into a superior society, and now it was time for America to reconnect with Europe and essentially fix what was broken. Pushing this perception that America was a vast melting pot of cultures that had learned how to get along, and it was time that this Americanism, this concept, get exported to the rest of the world so they would learn to stop fighting each other and how to get along. Again, very idealist. You could argue how accurate that perception is one way or the other, but this was a big motive, the idea of, again, this holy war that America would be waging, this dawn of a new era. Less idealistic were people who were coming from a sense of, let's see again if I can fit it, realism. This was a less radical way to look at it. The perception was that Germany was an aggressive regime. It had a terrible record of atrocities and war, and America had a moral obligation to put a stop to Germany's aggression. Additionally, there was a concern that if Germany lost this war, that at its core it was an aggressive nation. And yes, this time it had not targeted the United States directly, but maybe next time. Also, there was a concern that if Germany were to win, a common practice in European wars was that if one nation ended up defeating another nation, that they would trade off or give up overseas colonies. And the last thing that America wanted were British or French holdings in the Caribbean or other parts of the world suddenly becoming held by German and putting Germany having influence in their backyard. So this was a more realistic sense that this war had to end. That either way, whether idealism or realism, this war needed to end the war, and it needed to end the war on the side of the Allies. And this would bring about a more peaceful future in the long term. Now, my country, right or wrong, when you hear that phrase, you might think that this is sort of just a patriotic machismo saying. And certainly patriotism did play a role in this. But it was a more complicated and more diverse crowd than you might think. Again, to be sure, there were people who my country had declared war. I may not understand the war. I may not even like what the war is about, but my country's at war and I have to help. But there were other groups that also fell into this category. As I said, there had been a strong pressure to stay out of the war for many years, and now the country was at war. And there were people who had been vocal in their communities, in government, about not getting involved. And now they had to make a choice. And there was a strong pressure to conform. Either out of true sense of patriotism, that it's time to sort of lock arms and stick together, or out of a sense of they were trying to avoid blowback from people who would be critical of, well, you said you were against the war. And there was a good deal of pressure against people who had been anti-war or remained anti-war, both official government pressure, which we'll talk about, and also unofficial or more, you could even say vigilante pressure to harass and even sometimes to attack. There were people who were beaten, even killed by mobs, even blatantly in the street. Often targets were German Americans, which numbered in the millions. In fact, at that time, it's an interesting thing to note that as in today, the single largest ethnic group in the United States was German, or Germanic at least, and that remains so today. So again, the German American community, but also many other communities that, for whatever reason, were opposed to the war or had ties with the Central Powers, were forced with sort of a crisis point, that they had to decide whether they were going to conform with the greater American people. Again, right or wrong, they would choose their native nation or their adopted nation, or whether or not they were going to try to keep that distinction of either being German American or Austrian American or Turkish American. And again, conformity was often the way to, or supporting the war was often a way to show this conformity. The last section of this group were people looking for acceptance. The war gave ethnic minorities and immigrants an opportunity to essentially prove their worth to the country or to show their loyalty, which uh, I don't think always just came from a place of patriotism. It also just came from a place of practicality. Um, Talk about the immigration or the immigrant population first. Um, Immigration has always been a tense issue in American history, but it was particularly high in 1917. And there were lots of people, there was a lot of discrimination, there was a lot of tension, even violence about the growth of immigrant communities. And to give you a sense of that level of pressure of why there was so much tension, in 1917, 33% of Americans were either born outside the country or had at least one parent who had been born outside the country. Now, that's a huge number. Today, there's a lot of discussion about immigration, about, is America taking on different cultural or social attributes from its high levels of immigration. But to give you an idea of the comparison, today, 18% of Americans are either foreign born or have one foreign born parent. So about half as much as it was in 1917. So you can see how quickly this was a shift. And one of the reasons for this number, first of all, prior to the war, for some time, America had had a rather open immigration policy, but it had not really been much of an issue because prior to the advent of steamships and trains, people just couldn't move that fast, not in the numbers like they could now. So the United States was growing, it had a huge growing immigrant population. And again, it caused tensions, and this acceptance, this support for the war was a way that immigrant communities thought that they could ease this tension. And you did see this in the makeup of the U.S. Army at the time. By the time the war ended, 1 in 5 American soldiers had lived outside the United States for 10 years, or had only lived in the United States for 10 years or less. So that's 1 in 5, not 1 in 5 were immigrants. 1 in 5 were immigrants that had only lived in the United States for 10 years. I don't have the exact figures on this, but you can imagine if you expanded that out to anybody who had immigrated to the United States, if they came over as a child and lived their whole life, compare that to people who had one parent, compare that to people who were second or third generation. The American Army very much reflected the United States, and it was a nation of newcomers. And these different groups, not only did they have difficulty being accepted by the native-born population, but they also often somewhat distrusted each other. They came from countries that sometimes had conflicts with one another. And this path through right or wrong, my country, pursuing to support the war, to join the military, was perceived as a way to sort of amalgamate into the larger United States. Kind of a little side story, which I think kind of illustrates the extent of this, was I was reading that there was an American regiment during the Meuse-Argonne, the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, that was raised in the New York area, and it was stationed on the front lines. And German scouts were doing reconnaissance, and the German soldiers could overhear the American soldiers speaking with one another, and they were exclusively talking in Italian. So when they went back to their command, they filed that Italian units had been relocated to that sector of the front. But what the German scouts didn't realize is that all of these Italian speakers were Americans. They just were speaking their native language, or the language they were most comfortable with. So another group that took this route, which does have overlap with immigrants, but is also minority groups, whose leaders tried to mobilize their communities to support the war, again, to gain this acceptance. Two prominent of these groups were Jewish Americans and African Americans. Both of these groups struggled to be accepted into wider American society, even though that many of them had been in the country for generations. And it was the hope that a patriotic showing to their country would open the door for further acceptance as being fully Americans. And I know I brought this up a couple of times, but I will kind of sidetrack again to talk about the African American experience during the war, just because I find it particularly fascinating, and I think a story worth retelling is that this is 1917. So, and the African American community was possibly more so. In fact, I'd say probably more so than the Jewish American community, pushing that African Americans needed to support the war, needed to join the military, needed to be positive about the war, because slavery had only ended in the United States 50 years ago. I mean, think back. This slavery ended in the 1860s. I mean, think about how many of you alive today have some connection back to the 1960s today. That's the same gap of time. It wasn't a long time ago. And the shadows of slavery loomed large in American society. And there was a perception held by many whites at the time, it was not an uncommon perception, that African Americans were simple-minded and childlike in nature. And many of the national African American leaders, sort of the elites of the society and academia, encouraged the enlistment in the military in order to prove the value and worth of African American individuals, their competence, their intelligence. Though this would become difficult, both I did discuss the discriminatory practices that were in the Army. The U.S. Army was still segregated at that time, but many African American units were formed and fought in the war. After the war, Jewish Americans did receive a minor impact in how they were perceived by the rest of the population. It wasn't a big push, one way or the other. Sadly, despite the remarkable efforts by the African Americans, soldiers and people who supported the war in economic and support ways, did little to help their position in American society. Again, the details are out of the scope of this project, and I'd love to come back and do more work on this. I just don't know enough about it right now to tell a broader story of the African American experience in the First World War. But as I said, I feel it's a story that needs telling. But in short, I'll add that at the end of the war, there were thousands of African American war veterans that returned home, and instead of being celebrated, they were often viewed as with suspicion, or having moved beyond their station, or thinking too highly of themselves. This is in 1918 and 1919. About 6 months, a little more than 6 months after the war ended, there was a period that became known as the Red Summer, where there was a flurry of murders and violence against African Americans all across the United States. And African American war veterans were often the focus of this violence. They were viewed as agitators and people who were trying to change the social order in which African Americans belonged on the bottom. So this goal for acceptance did not work for that particular community. Now, it's important to remember, though, moving forward back to the main topic, that people didn't file neatly into one camp or the other. American society was just as complicated and multifaceted as it is today. But you did have this meeting in the middle. Notice war support. I'm not writing in the boxes today. You had the high-minded ideals to change the world and the war to end war. And much of this was top-down, coming from newspapers, academics, politicians. The right or wrong, My Country, Right or Wrong, was often more, though certainly had its more influential leaders, was very much a bottom-up system, sort of a grassroots, and an opportunity for, but anyway, both of these connected and provided an opportunity for many factors or many factions within American society to interact with each other that hadn't interacted before, and were trying to find a way uh, to sort of trust each other, to work together. And both of these cases did have, I guess, would you consider unintended consequences. Many people with a mixture of these motivations, they joined the war. For example, uh, the war to end all war gave a sense to many young Americans, many young men, that there would be no more wars after this, that this was their chance to get out and have this adventure, this way to test their manhood on the field of battle, because after this it wouldn't happen again. So many young men did join for that reason, because they thought this would be the last war. Um, and of course, there were other people who had no motives really whatsoever. They simply were drafted. The majority of American soldiers were drafted and not volunteers. But all motivations aside, again, I can't overstate the massive support that the war engendered. And I think an interesting comparison, even though World War II also had a massive push to nationalize the war effort, in World War I, much less of this was legally mandated. Uh, for example, in World War II, there was mandatory rationing. In World War I, there was rationing, but it was, for your average citizen, predominantly voluntary. Um, so here, let's discuss some of the ways that the average American supported the war. There was rationing. And when I say voluntary, though, you can take that term with a pretty big grain of salt. Citizens were encouraged to eat less, to grow their own food. It's actually the First World War. This term would get used in the Second World War as well, but to plant victory gardens, to grow your own food, to limit how much food you need to purchase from farmers. A common system was to have things published in the papers, like that the community would have meatless Monday or wheatless Wednesday, fuelless Friday, and so on. And these were pushes that you were to go one day without, so these resources could go to the war effort. I think kind of an interesting aspect here was that, kind of just on a side note, is the impacts that some of this had. That prior to the First World War, if you were to look at American fashion, it often celebrated what we would call full-figured individuals. But during the war, this fell out of fashion. You can kind of see fashion being mobilized for the war effort. That thinness became what the fashionable thing was. And you do see that if you look at the fashion of the 1920s, very, very thin, both men and women, that was the desirable trait to have. This sort of, in turn, fell out of fashion during the Great Depression, when thinness became more out of necessity than choice. But the other big aspect and it's hard, this doesn't seem radical to us at the time, but at the time it was that women needed to enter the workforce. This was almost unheard of prior to this. But there was a big push that men needed to go to war, men needed to go into certain sectors in the military that could only be performed by men at this time. And there were farming jobs and weapons manufacturing and industrial jobs that needed to be filled, and there just weren't enough men to do it. So women were encouraged actively by the government and their communities to get out and to get jobs in these industries. Again, another interesting fashion effect that this had was that prior to 1917, American women did not wear pants. Maybe it happened once or twice, I don't know, but women's pants were not made, they were not sold. But during, when you're working in a industrial munitions plant, dresses and skirts don't really work too well. So women started to wear pants, they started to wear overalls, and by the end of the war, many women found that they liked wearing pants, and that since the end of the First World War, you start seeing clothing lines market women's designs of pants to be sold to women. So again, an interesting way about how the war inadvertently affected society. There were also war support came in a way of essentially kind of this right or wrong, my country. Draw a little band-aid here. People just kind of trying to cover up tensions in American society in order to put their differences aside to support the war. I think an interesting example of that was that regiments raised in the Chicago area contained many members of the Illinois State National Guard. It also contained many members of what was known as the Industrial Workers of the World organization, which was a radical socialist union that did not support the war. And it's ironic that these men who fought together in the war, though literally just a year or two prior, or in the years prior to the war, these men had actually been fighting in riots in the streets, and had been, as the National Guard, had to routinely be called in to break up strikes and riots in Chicago. And there was a lot of nervousness about throwing all these people together, but for whatever reason, or however they were able to manage it, the people from these the National Guard units and the socialist unions actually did function as cohesive units during the war, and ironically had more combat experience than many Americans, simply because their experience in the riots, the labor riots. Now, I've said that these actions were more voluntary, that they weren't governmentally enforced, and again, as I said, to take that with a grain of salt. That is true because the government often didn't need to enforce these things. This was a time before television, before radio. Newspaper was the all-powerful media source in an American city, in American towns. Even little rinky-dink towns often had a number of papers that would print several times a day. And what these towns would often do to ensure that this war support was moving is that there would be unofficial groups called patriot committees, or other similarly sounding names. The Organization for American Unity, or something like that. And these groups would form, and they would keep an eye out on their neighbors. And for example, let's say a restaurant was serving meat on Meatless Monday. People from this group might show up on that restaurant the next day and have a chat with the owner. And if the owner didn't agree to comply with the recommended rationing, they risked organized boycotts. They risked vandalism, sometimes outright violence. Newspapers would publish the names of people who hadn't been seen at a bond drive, drives to donate money to the war effort, people who had been seen breaking this taboo or that taboo. And there was a lot of social pressure, and again, not above resorting to violence or intimidation to ensure that this support stayed strong. The government was fully aware of these efforts, and they didn't have a problem with it. But there were official efforts as well. Congress had passed laws that gave the government hugely expanded powers during the war to crack down on anti-war or even not sufficiently pro-war sentiments. Jail time and fines were not uncommon for those who were vocal oppositions to the war. And in fact, many of these laws that we have on the books today, when you've heard about people in the news, there's been stories of military people leaking information, going to jail for various times. These laws actually have their origins in the laws passed to support the war during 1917, 1918. In the end, it's hard to say how much of the national pro-war sentiment was the result of propaganda and coercion, and how much was genuine support for the war. I believe that even though that the motives varied widely, I think that most Americans were in favor of the war, and were not overly coerced to show this. I think that just comes from the fact of the sheer accomplishments, the ability. I think, I don't have the number with me, so I wouldn't take this directly, but I believe the number I read was that American food exports raised by 20% during the war, which essentially came from people working extra hours and people eating less. There was a huge accomplishment, and though there was these pressures, the United States, even at that time, didn't have anything resembling a secret police force or something that more authoritarian nations had to rely on to force their compliance. So yes, the U.S. government was certainly heavy-handed. There certainly were violence and heavy-handed events done by individual citizens. But again, I do want to say that these motives were very strong, and it did transform the nation from a nation where everybody was kind of doing their own thing to where everybody kind of, eat, slept, breathed through the war. Um, with that said, let's kind of prepare for our next video, give a little bit of a teaser. We're going to move from this more of a high perspective overview to more of a detailed perception now. And the reason I tie that in is because a lot of these details can sort of get lost in the mud and blood of warfare and fighting. I think a story that illustrates this well was that newspapers, often American newspapers, would cover soldiers during the war, and they would say things like that when the American soldiers charged into battle, they would shout things like, "Remember the Lusitania," which was the British ship that was sunk by German submarines that had many American deaths. Or they would shout, "For democracy," as they would climb out of their trenches. But I also read numerous accounts that soldiers read these papers and were quite surprised, saying that they didn't have any recollection of this. Most of them saying in personal memories that what they remember is when the signal to charge came, just letting out a series of big shouts and then followed by a steady stream of profanities. So you can see that even for all this high-minded idealism, once you get into war, it becomes something very different. So with that said, thank you for listening. I hope that this was informational for you, and see you in the next video. Thank you.